Okay. Okay, let's get going here. Sorry, I'm a couple minutes late. Always takes a second to get set up. Okay. That got darker all of a sudden. Why did that happen? I clearly hit a button. All right, we're just gonna go with it. Okay. I don't know what's going on. All right, so we're gonna jump in here. We're gonna start in, and I'm gonna keep going as quick as I can. Oh, I see what happened. I'm gonna start going as quick as I can. We're gonna try to get through the section on social research for sure today, and then move into maybe culture if we have time. So we can try to fit in one more topic before the midterm. Okay. Okay, let's quiet down a little here. So we've got some questions from last time. So last time, just to kind of remind you, last time we were talking about, kind of scientific versus unscientific thinking, and obviously the goal in sociology is to think about society from a scientific rather than unscientific perspective, right? So we talked about tradition, right? Ideas that people have from the past that maybe aren't based on fact. Authority, claims that because some kind of authority figure says something, it is inherently therefore true. Casual observations, right? Things we say, but only based on our incomplete look at the world. Overgeneralizing, right? Taking small aspects of the social world and making broad claims about it. And then, you just see what you want to see, selective observation. Qualification, right? It's true for most people, but not for me. Wow, my mic cut out there for a sec. Illogical reasoning, right? Conspiracy theories, seeing patterns where none exist. Ego defense, rejecting ideas because they go against your ideology. Premature closure of inquiry. I keep wanting to say industry. I don't know why. Premature closure of inquiry, basically saying we know all we know, and mystification, suggesting there are greater forces at play than we could understand. Okay, when is the midterm? So, my wife, lovely as she is, at one point threatened to have a series of 5 shirts made for me in different colors, and on each shirt are printed the words, "The answers you seek are in the syllabus." She never followed through on that threat, but there are times where I think of that. I don't remember. I think it's in the first week of February. The answers you seek are in the syllabus. Okay. The syllabus is on Canvas. So the answers you seek are in the syllabus on Canvas. Okay, so let's talk about these questions. The Color Purple, The Lovely Bones, The Hate You Give, The Duff, The Hunger Games, Handmaid's Tales are book banned in some American schools. Thoughts? I think The Handmaid's Tale is a bad book. I'm not happy it's banned, but I still think it's a bad book. Margaret Atwood is a trash writer. Those are my thoughts. And I would fight her on this point, even though she's like 80, like physically. No, I'm kidding. I really dislike Margaret Atwood. This maybe comes from my background in English, where every Canadian lit class was like a close study of Margaret Atwood. And it was like, good grief. She's not a good writer, guys. Anyway, that's my thought. Is the rejection of the Holocaust in Nazism considered unscientific, or is it simply a defense of their beliefs in Hitler? I mean, so here, this might be, I would probably put this as ego defense, right? In a lot of cases, people who are committed to a kind of view of Hitler or Nazism in some particular way sometimes deny the Holocaust for particular reasons. It's also like a conspiracy theory, right? So it's also illogical reasoning, discounting the evidence, and seeing patterns of like conspiracy to pretend that the Holocaust happened, which it clearly did, by the way. The evidence is pretty overwhelming. Is saying something like 9/11 was an inside job illogical reasoning? It is absolutely illogical reasoning. And here, this is the thing. When you think about illogical reasoning, right, you're seeing patterns where none exist. So you're putting together evidence, right? When you think evidence, right, okay, the other one that we can talk about is like flat Earth. Because for one reason or another, a friend of mine kept sending me links to like this flat Earth chat on Facebook for some reason, because he thought it was funny. And like they have evidence. It's dumb, but it's evidence, right? They're like, well, have you ever tried this, or have you ever thought of this, right? And they cite a bunch of like evidence, but really their evidence is either misconstrued, or they're putting together facts that kind of seem like they fit together, but actually are kind of nonsense, right? So this is illogical reasoning, right? It's like, oh, I have this fact over here and this fact over there, and they're not connected, but if I connect them, then everything opens up, right? That's a conspiracy theory. Can we actually label conspiracy theories as illogical reasoning when there are times that they are verified, confirmed years later, i.e. aliens? If aliens have been confirmed, if you could let me know, because I hadn't heard that. All I heard was conspiracy theories about it. So we're gonna go with that. I'm waiting for like one of them to beam down, like Star Trek style, and say, take me to your leader. In which case I would say, you don't want to meet our leaders. You probably just want to go back where you came from. Like I'm not gonna lie. They're not exactly the greatest crowd of people. It's probably just better. Ignore Earth. We're good. Doesn't premature closure of inquiry contradict illogical reasoning? Contradict illogical reasoning. Well, okay, so these aren't mutually, these are not mutually exclusive categories, right? Someone could be in one. You might have premature closure of inquiry, or you can have illogical reasoning. You don't have to have all 10 kinds at the same time. So I don't know. Hopefully I answered your question. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so when we're doing sociological research, right, and I'll say we basically have two kinds of sociological research that we do. One of them is quantitative. Quantitative. Generally, this is concerned with turning social phenomenon into numbers, right? So measuring something. And then we have qualitative, which is about talking about people's experiences. Qualitative is about experience, right? Okay, when we're talking especially about quantitative, right? What the frickle pickle did I do? Okay. That's right. I said what the frickle pickle. Okay, I guess I dragged from the top and somehow that killed my PowerPoint. When we're talking about quantitative, right, trying to quantify or turn social phenomena into numbers and things that we can measure, one of the big things that we try to have is, so we're obviously interested typically in talking about a population, right? a whole group that we're interested in studying, right? And this can be anything, like this could be Albertans, this could be Canadians, you know, this could be students, right? Your population can be almost anything you want. Now, for the most part, studying a whole population outside of really, really small groups is virtually impossible, right? Like if I wanted to run a survey of U of A students, right? There's what, about 44,000 students at U of A? Or 30,000, I can't remember. Sending a survey to every single person at the U of A and getting them to complete it would be basically impossible. So typically what we do is we instead study a sample of that population, right? Part of the population that you're interested in that you select for analysis. Okay, so for example, I was having this debate with some friends of mine just this morning over WhatsApp, because this poll came out from a polling company called SOC that basically said that since Donald Trump was elected, the Liberals have jumped up in the Canadian polls by about 20%, right? They've crossed the 30% boundary for support. Every other poll says they're still absolutely in the toilet, but ECOS says that they're high up. And because my friend is a big Liberal supporter, he's like, look, the Liberals are on a comeback, right? Mark Carney's going to be prime minister, and the golden age will continue forever. And I'm like, okay, no, let's look at what ECOS did, right? They sampled 2,047 people using phones, right? And then we can analyze what's in that data, right? It's not like all Canadians, and I think ECOS used a very flawed sample. But they didn't study all Canadians, right? They're doing an opinion poll of Canadians, and they surveyed 2,047 of them, right? Not the whole Canadian population, because that's what, like 41 million? It'd be hard to get 41 million people to answer a poll. Instead, you get a sample of that. And any kind of political polling that you've ever seen, right, any kind of sociological study is always a sample, right, rather than the whole population. Okay. All right. I'll say, even if you were doing like qualitative research and say let's say you wanted to talk about what it's like to be, let's think of a group, to be a Hell's Angel, right? What is it like to be a Hell's Angel? You probably can't, and you wanted to get deep into their experiences. You wanted to know from a personal perspective what it's like to be a Hell's Angel, right? And you went to interview a bunch of Hell's Angels. You're still dealing with a sample because you can't interview every single Hell's Angel. So we're always dealing with subgroups of a population that in sociology we call the sample. Okay, so one goal of scientific research, right? And remember, sociology thinks of itself as a social science. So we want, at least when we're doing our job well, some kind of scientific pretense to it all, right? So the goal is to get objective results, especially if you're doing quantitative research. And we tend to talk about objectivity by the degree of consistency between observers, right? Or between the observations of independent observers. So in the same way that we have like the scientific method in the natural sciences, in social sciences, the ideal is that if two people looked at the same data set, they'd come to similar conclusions. Okay. That's an interesting question. Sorry. Does logical reasoning require a rejection of truth, or does it apply? Yeah, I mean, anytime I think you're filling in the gaps and making a connection, between missing facts, things that we don't know, and like filling it in with like a conspiracy or any logical chain of conclusion, you could be in illogical reasoning. Okay. Do I think President Trump being president for the next few months could change Canadian minds to vote for Liberals to specifically avoid anything related to Trump? You know who you should ask this question to? A political scientist. Because they're scientists of politics and they probably know, right? Or I'm going to go with that. Okay. Sorry. I don't know. You know, can I make a confession? I'm really bad at predicting things. Anytime I do like I think last class someone asked, like, do you think this that the Trump administration basically banning or going to male and female as the only two genders, is going to trickle into Canada? And I was like, yeah, probably not. We have a different culture. And literally yesterday, Pierre Poilievre was like, I only know of two genders. And I'm like, oh, I was wrong. Whoopsie. So I'm really, really bad. If you want to ask me questions about the future, I'm like really bad at predicting things. I enter a playoff hockey pool every single year, and I've been doing it for 20 years. Do you want to know how many times I have picked the correct team to win the Stanley Cup in 20 years? Precisely 0. Maybe I picks with my heart instead of with my head. I don't know. So, all of your questions about what do you think is going to happen? I'm like, guys, I don't know. I'm really bad at making predictions. And you know what? Here's the truth. Most smart people are really bad at making predictions for whatever reason. Okay. Maybe we're not as smart as we think we are. And maybe I'm not even smart. I don't know. Let's move on. Okay, the importance of viewpoint. So, our concepts and our principles tend to shape reality, right? Every sociologist has a point of view, right? Everybody has maybe not an ideology, though a lot of sociologists have a really strong ideological bent. And this very much often shapes the way we see the world, and sometimes, shapes the way we do research, how we present things, and all of that. One of the things we know from sociology, right, and especially if we think of our symbolic interactionist kind of point of view, the point of view from which you look at the world actually shapes what you experience. And two people with very different ideologies, very different worldviews, will see the same event and think very, very different things, right? Just for example, I have friends who are very devout Catholics, like they have like 11 kids, like very devout Catholics, and friends who are like, can I say devout atheists? I'm going to go with it. Or absolute, ardent atheists. And, I love to hear them debating because it'll be like, one is like, okay, look at this case of this person who is healed. It's a miracle. And the other person, is like, no, that's just something we can't explain, right? Your different viewpoint shapes what you experience and how you understand the world. And your viewpoint inherently matters to the reality that you experience. And this is no less true for researchers. Okay. When we're talking about research, doing research, there's kind of two positions that you can do research from. And they're both inherently very valuable, but they're both very different. One of them is obviously an insider perspective, and one is an outsider perspective. So, your social position as either an insider or an outsider shapes what you know and how you experience the world. So as an insider, what are things you can see, right? Like if you're talking about your own group, let's say your own culture, and you're studying your own culture, right? An insider's position, gives you unique experiences, provides intimate sensitivities, right? You really know what's going on, and understandings that are inaccessible to outsiders, right? If you're all quite young for the most part, but if you go and do a study abroad term in a culture that is not your own, right? One of the things you realize is that there's all sorts of insider speak that you do not get, right? There's all sorts of little cultural references that people will throw out there casually that make absolutely no sense to you because you miss them, right? And insiders will catch all of that stuff. I did my PhD on Russian television, which was fun, super duper fun. I am not Russian. I learned, to speak and read Russian as an adult. And so I'm missing a lot of those insider cues. So there was always stuff I was aware that I was missing. And that when, Russians look at my work, they see the things that I'm missing because I don't always get the in-jokes. Okay, outsiders see things differently though, right? And is a different viewpoint. And sometimes outsiders see the kind of assumptions that insiders make from the outside, right? You can see where, members of a group sometimes are blind to their own assumptions. So each of these is valuable in doing research. Okay. I look forward to it. That'll be fun. Find out that there are little green men in Arizona. They've actually crashed there and they've been chilling, running a B&B or something. That'd be awesome. Okay, so qualitative research. So I talked about that a second ago, right? Qualitative research, I think, did I skip a slide? No. Qualitative research. Qualitative research, what is it, right? So we want to talk about the quality of experiences, right? Frickle pickle. I shouldn't write too close to the top of the slide. The quality of experiences. Okay, that's experiences. I'm sorry. Bad handwriting. So, when we do qualitative research, right? Now, the most typical way that people do qualitative research is interviews, to talk to people who've experienced something and hear their perspective, or participant observation, which is actually going and kind of watching people in their natural social environment, right? Sometimes it kind of looks like hanging out. So what do you do to do qualitative research? Well, you figure out what you want to study, you collect evidence, you analyze that evidence, and then you interpret it, right, and write what happened. So when we talk about, there are two forms of research. Qualitative, right? So this is about experiences. Generally, qualitative experience goes in the following way. You start by getting data, and then you generate a theory out of it. This is referred to as inductive, right? So you're doing inductive research. From the data, you're getting the theory. Okay, the data is inducing a theoretical perspective. Okay, quantitative research, which is much more common, and the big one is surveys. Love surveys. So, quantitative research is all about numbers, right? It's numbers and turning social phenomenon into numbers. And generally, it goes from theory to data. So you start with an idea, right? An idea that you want to prove or disprove. You come up with a hypothesis, or two or three. Hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3. And then you collect data, and you use that data to test your hypothesis, right? You collect it, you analyze it, and you see if you were right. So how this usually looks is like something like, the research study that I was reading a couple of weeks ago. So basically, this was a study, and I was kind of looking at it because I teach a class on the sociology of youth and religion. And one of the kind of questions that I found interesting is what is the relationship between porn use and secularization, or people losing their religion, right? And what the authors did was they came up with 3 hypotheses about how increasing the amount of pornography that someone consumes would affect their religious kind of identity, the religious belief, the religious practice. They got data from an existing data set. They didn't run a new survey. They took it from the National Study of Family Structures in the US, and then they tested, because I guess there's a bunch of questions about porn use. And they tested their 3 hypotheses, and then they wrote their conclusions that they think decline in religiosity actually leads to more porn use, not the other way around. That's what quantitative research does, right? You come up with a theory, you figure out what data you need to test it, you test it, and then you come to your conclusions. Okay. Can I re-explain intimate sensitivities? Yeah, I can do that. Okay. Let me go back for 1 second, and I'll clear off the... So, intimate sensitivities. When you're an insider, right, think of a group that you know really well, right? Something that you're a part of. Like let's say someone was studying your Dungeons and Dragons group. Because I know you all have one, right? You all play Dungeons and Dragons secretly. My daughter started playing Dungeons and Dragons recently with her friends, and she's like, Dad, can we have my friends over to play Dungeons and Dragons? And I'm like, yes. Anytime you want. This seems like the world's most wholesome activity, so let's do it. But if someone was studying your Dungeons and Dragons group, you probably have a bunch of lingo and a bunch of history, right? Let's say you've been playing the Dungeons and Dragons with the same group of people for 5 years, right? And you've done campaign after campaign after campaign. There's a really good chance that, you would have a bunch of inside jokes, right? You would probably have lingo. You would have, let's say, remember whens. Now, if you are studying your own Dungeons and Dragons group, you know what all of this means, right? You would know what every inside joke meant. You would know all of the lingo. And when, someone was like, remember when, 3 campaigns ago, you tried to hit that bear with the back of your sword because you didn't want to kill it, and it actually mauled you, and you had to create a new character, right? That actually happened to my daughter in her second Dungeons and Dragons outing. She's like, oh, is the bear cute? And the dungeon master said, yes, the bear is cute. She's like, I don't want to kill it. Imaginary bear. So she tried hitting it with the pommel of her sword, and then it ate her. So you would know all those remember whens. If someone was coming from the outside, when you're like, hey, do you remember when? They would have no idea what that means, right? So you could study your Dungeons and Dragons group in a way that's sensitive to all of the intimate things that go on within it that other people wouldn't have access to. Okay, I'm going to hope that answered that question. Okay. In quantitative reasoning, like biological sciences, is a theory the same as a hypothesis? So where you test the hypothesis with an experiment. Okay, so this is a good question. Kind of. So generally, your theory would be your general sense of, okay, so let's say for the example that I was talking about, right, this study I read, the theory that that these two scholars had was that much of the literature on, pornography use and its relationship to decreased religious salience in young people, that was the directionality of it, right? That more porn use leads to less kind of religious salience. What their theory was that actually they thought that had the direction of causation backwards. They thought a decline in religious salience probably led to more porn use. And so their hypotheses were okay, so if we test this, right? So if we test, say, the timing of when people said that, their religious salience declined through quantitative data, was looking at ages, right? So the correlation between someone's age, how much porn they use, and what they say their religious salience is, we theorize that actually that directionality is different. They had 3 hypotheses. I don't remember them off the top of my head. So that's broad theory, and then specific hypotheses of what they would find in the data that would support it. So it's a little bit different than, say, in biological sciences, or how shall we say, lesser social sciences, like psychology. No, I'm kidding. I just love to throw shade on psychology, because my experience of psychology as an undergrad was so bad. I think I've told you, but I won't tell you again. So in sociology, we don't tend to do experiments, right? Because we tend to want to see how people exist in their natural social environment rather than these artificially created situations. In psychology, you'll get a lot of times where people do lab studies, right? Where it's like, you know, they want to see how someone would react, like whether someone would be able to do math problems when classical music is playing or heavy metal music is playing. So they would give you a math test and play some classical music, and they give someone else a math test and play heavy metal music. That's more of an experimental design. Very rarely does sociology use experimental design because we're more interested in kind of the natural social world than an artificially created one. There are exceptions, but if you want to find out about them, you're going to have to come take Intro to Methods, because I want to get through social research as quickly as possible. Okay, that's a good question. It's a little different, right? Okay, so ethical considerations. That's funny, I just got through research ethics yesterday with my Intro to Methods class. How fun. Okay, so there's basically a couple of critical concepts when we think about the ethics of doing social research. One of them, or the first two are the most important. Voluntary participation, right? You want your participants to actually want to be there and have agreed, right? And harm minimization, which is basically, you know, you inform people of the risks and benefits. And they agree, right? So you've minimized harm by telling them if anything bad could happen to them as part of your study, and they agree to it. Along with that, right to privacy and authenticity. So, you know, the right to privacy, people have the right to, you know, not have you expose private details that they might not otherwise want exposed. So, you know, sometimes if you're doing qualitative research and you've interviewed them and you want to use their information, you might use a pseudonym, right? A fake name for them when you write it up. And authenticity, generally speaking, you're not allowed to lie to your participants about what you're doing. Okay. How many, I'm just going to check something very quickly. How many slides do I have left in this? Dear God, 40 slides. Okay. I thought this was much shorter. All right, we're going to blast. We're going to keep going. All right. So when we're doing quantitative research, right, we're trying to turn things into numbers. You need to be able to turn a social phenomenon into a number. This process is called operationalization, which is basically how are you going to turn a concept, right? A concept or an idea, let's say like loneliness. Nah, short, pavidi. A concept, say something like loneliness, into something that you can measure. That's operationalization, right? So, the goal of operationalization is to take a concept like loneliness and turn it into one or more variables. You know, things that you can ask, say, on a survey and measure. So you could ask them, you know, how many friends they have as a way of operationalizing a concept of loneliness, right? And then you could measure, you know, how many friends they have from 0 to 100 or less, or anything in between or more, right? You can measure how many friends someone has. So you're putting things into numerical terms. Okay, and your hypothesis, I think we know this, is a testable form of an argument or proposition, right? So you make a proposition and you test it using data. Okay, experiments, which again, we don't really do in sociology that much. Carefully controlled artificial situations that allow researchers to isolate hypothesized causes and precisely measure their effects, right? Like I said, this is more of a psychology thing. Typically, there are sociological experiments. They're just pretty rare. And when you do experiments, generally you randomize your participants, your research subjects, so that you don't control the outcomes by picking who's in your, you know, and typically you have an experimental group. Experimental. And you have a control group. Okay. I told you we'd go fast through this. Okay. My son gets to texted me during class, so he gets to get yelled at after class. Okay, so, I just said this, okay. The experimental group, right, is the group that's exposed to your independent variable. The independent variable is your cause in the cause and effect relationship. So like if you were doing an experiment, right, and you wanted to say, how does caffeine impact your ability to remember, let's say, remember a list of words? The independent variable, so the thing that you would give people, would be caffeine. And then the thing you would test is, would drinking like a Red Bull or a, what's the new one that everyone loves? I can't remember now. Celsius. All the grad students in our department are drinking Celsius. Would giving everybody, someone a Celsius, allow them to remember more words off that list of words, right? What's its effect on memory? So you're seeing, if introducing your independent variable would cause a change in your dependent variable. You probably do this through a pre-test, post-test. Pre-test, you test how many words someone can remember without caffeine, and then you give them caffeine, and then you test them again. Pre-test, post-test. Okay. And your control group, you don't give them caffeine. You just see how many words they can remember on 2 lists. Basically to see if there's something about the experiment that's flawed, whether your independent variable is actually causing the change or if it's something else. Okay. Should I give you another example? No. Oh, maybe I will. I'll give you a classic example of this in a kind of different setting. Or maybe I'll talk about spurious. I'll save it in a minute, actually. I'll save my example for a minute from now. Because there's one more slide where this applies. Okay. Validity. When we talk about validity in sociology, we're talking about the degree to which a measure actually measures what you intended to measure, right? So sometimes you might actually end up measuring the wrong thing, right? The tool that you're using, whatever it happens to be, captures a different piece of information. In that case, you would say what you did was not valid. And reliability, the degree to which your results are consistent. So very similar to, say, any kind of scientific experimentation. Okay, how am I doing for no questions? All right, as I said, our top, and personally my favorite, I love writing surveys. If you major in sociology and you end up taking social research methods, I spend like a good week on how to write survey questions. I think it's super fun. Surveys, right? Basically, surveys is a list of questions, to ask people about their knowledge, attitudes, or behaviors. Sometimes face-to-face, though that's increasingly rare. We used to do a lot of phone interviews or paper and pencil interviews, but increasingly most surveys now are done online. And all of the surveys I've done with people are always online. This is probably the most widely used social research method, right? It's the one that we do the most of because it's quick, cheap, and relatively easy. And typically contains 2 kinds of questions, closed-ended and open-ended. And a closed-ended question would be something like, rate your agreement with the following statement, aliens are real. And then you'd have like strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, disagree or strongly disagree, right? That's a closed-ended question. There's no space for someone to write or give their own thoughts. An open-ended question usually is like a box, and it's like, tell us what you think about aliens, and then people write down their thoughts. 9/11 was an inside job. They've been in Roswell for 50 years, and all of that stuff. Okay. So, like I said, we use samples, right? So we use samples in most social research because we can't look at the whole population. And what we're generally looking for is what's called a representative sample. So a representative sample is basically a sample that matches the population closely enough and is big enough that you can confidently say you could generalize it out to the population, right? So when you have a representative sample, so it reflects the population, you can say that your findings, any of them, are statistically significant. And to a point, as your sample size grows, so does the likelihood of finding statistically significant results. I don't know why that got separated here. That's supposed to go there. Okay. So, generally it goes like this. At 300, you have about an 8% error. At 400, that drops to about 5. At 900, 900, you're looking at about a 2% error, plus or minus. And then beyond 900, 1500-ish, it's basically like about a 1% margin of error, plus or minus. And beyond, basically any random sample of 1,500 people typically gives you very accurate results within about 1%. Any bigger than that usually doesn't make a huge difference. Okay. So, I told you I'd move quickly through this. We got lots of time. We're doing well. All right. A relationship between two variables exists if the value of one changes with the other. And the strength of that relationship is determined by the degree of change. So how this typically works, right? Like in the example that I was using before. So if you give someone caffeine here at time 1, and then their ability to remember the number of words on a list that you gave them increases, you would say that there is a relationship between caffeine consumption and words remembered. The strength of that relationship would be determined by, let's say, how strong it was. So, if it increases by they remember one more word, you would say that has a relatively weak relationship. But let's say that you gave them a Celsius and then asked them to remember a list of words, and on your pretest they remembered 5, and on the post-test, after you give them caffeine, they remember 25, then you would say that's a strong relationship. Okay. All right, this is what I was saving my other example for. To establish whether an independent variable causes a change in a dependent variable, researchers have to satisfy 3 criteria. So, like I was saying on the last slide, there has to be a relationship, right? When your independent variable is present, you have to see a change in your dependent variable. There's a sequencing question, right? So let's say you were giving a bunch of word tests. This is a bad example, but we'll go with it anyway. If you were giving a bunch of word tests, and the person is remembering more and more words, you give them caffeine here, and they continue to remember more and more words. You've kind of messed up the sequencing, right? Because clearly something else was happening here that caused them to remember more words before you introduced your independent variable. So there you would say that there is a spurious variable, something else. Maybe they're waking up, right? Maybe you started at 8 o'clock in the morning and your person you're experimenting on isn't awake, and as they wake up, they're remembering more words, and then you give them caffeine, and that process continues. But they were already remembering more words before you gave them the caffeine. Okay, so there's something else, or a third variable, sometimes also referred to as a confound or a confounding variable that's messing up your analysis. Okay, so, and here's where my favorite sociology example comes in. I'm going to erase it so I can write more on the slide. Okay, so non-spuriousness. You have to determine whether or not there is another or several other variables that might be causing the change in your dependent variable. And the classic example of this is the relationship between ice cream and, that's a knife, and then we're going to have a dripping blood, murder. Okay, ice cream and murder. So did you know that there is a relationship between increases in ice cream sales and increases in murders? And this is actually well established in a whole bunch of literature, that as ice cream sales go up, more murders are committed. So, can you say that ice cream sales cause murder? Question mark. Okay, so obviously you can't, right? Ice cream sales don't actually cause murder, but this is a real relationship, and this is a real kind of data set that people have put together, mostly to prove where people can make sort of, false assumptions or, illogical connections. Here it's based on a spurious variable. So what connects and what is the thing that actually causes, there to look like there's a connection between these two things? Heat. I'm leaving. Goodbye. I give up on, no. Okay, so this is a classical spurious relationship, right? Ice cream sales rise when it gets hot, obviously, right? Because people are hot, they want to buy something cold, so you buy more ice cream in the summer when it's hot. Murders also increase when it's hot for a bunch of reasons. First of all, people are outside. And when you're outside, you're more likely to be murdered. Why? Because you're outside with other people, and when it's hot outside, people get grumpy. Like, people get ill-tempered. And the hotter it gets, the more likely people are to be impulsive and angry, because heat kind of makes you grumpy in lots of ways. So what's actually causing the increase in murders in this relationship is it's hot outside, people are outside more, so they're more exposed, and people are more ill-tempered, so more encounters that people have escalate into physical confrontations, which leads to people killing each other, right? So heat increases murder, not ice cream. In this case, it's the heat that's causing the increase in both. But it makes it look like there's a relationship between ice creams and murder where there isn't one. Okay. Yes.
I still don't understand how to use non-spurious in a sentence. Like, how does that apply to heat?
Okay, so that's a good question. Hang on, I'm going to clear this off. So non-spuriousness. So so another way of saying non-spurious is authentic. So let's say you had a phenomenon, right? Two things that affect each other. Let's say, let's just go back to our example. Heat and ice cream sales, right? So what you would look at there is you would say, as the heat increases, ice cream sales also increase. So if the relationship is non-spurious, right? So there isn't something else here causing the change instead of the heat, then you could say that relationship's authentic, right? Or non-spurious. So there's a spurious variable is a variable that's getting in the way of you seeing that authentic relationship. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. So basically the spurious is the one that's getting in the way. It's confusing you into thinking that there's a relationship when there isn't one, right? So that's why it's sometimes called a confound or a confounding variable, because as a researcher, it has confounded you into thinking that a relationship exists where there is none. Okay, I think I answered your question? Perfect, awesome. Other questions, hang on. Can I explain sequencing again? Does sequencing basically mean the only variable? No. Okay, so think about sequencing as timing. Hang on, I'll go back here and I'll erase again. Stop it. Sequencing is timing, right? So I'm going to make up an example. Okay, so let's say here, we'll go back to our relationship between heat and murder, right? And we'll pretend that it's not linked. So let's say that the temperature started rising towards 35 degrees C. And then your murder rate started to go up, right? And so you're like, okay, more heat equals more murder. But when you look at the data, you actually find that the beginning of the increase in murder actually started during a period where it was 21 degrees for a week, right? So the temperature hadn't changed. The sequencing in that relationship is off, right? Because your increase in murders started before the increase in the temperature. So in that case, you would have to say something else is causing the increase in murders because the sequencing is off, right? Or the timing. In this case, your independent variable, right? Your IV and your DV starts to change before the introduction of your independent variable. So here, rule of thumb, anytime dependent variable changes before the independent variable, you've got a sequencing problem. Meaning that something is out of sequence, right? The change in the dependent variable is obviously not being caused in my example that I created here by heat. Maybe it's being caused by a spike in the drug trade, right? So there's a spike in the drug trade. I don't know, a shipment of fentanyl came in from Vancouver when it was 21 degrees, and that caused the spike in murders rather than, the heat. So hopefully, does that make sense? I think. It's a good question. To be honest, I'd have to look at the literature because I don't know it off the top of my head. But we'll go. We can maybe talk about that when we talk about crime, and I can look it up, or ask my one friend who specializes in radicalization. Okay, so how a spurious relationship occurs, right? Basically, what I just explained. There's a third or control variable affecting both your dependent and independent variable, right? So in this case, ice cream, and in this case, heat. No, wait, that's backwards. Heat. I'm sorry, I got that. I'm messing that up. I mean, ice cream and murder. I did this example too many times. Okay, our independent variable, right? Ice cream. And our dependent variable, murder. Something is affecting and is changing both of them, right? Which is, Mr. Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, right? The heat. So that's how a spurious relationship occurs when some other variable that you weren't accounting for is affecting both of your other variables, your independent and your dependent. Okay, cool. Right, and how an authentic relationship occurs, it's your independent variable affecting your dependent variable directly. So, straight up. All right, we're gonna make it. Okay, so a causal connection, right? So one thing is causing the other, right? You have a cause and effect relationship, or a causal relationship between two variables when the variables systematically change together, right? So in our example of heat and murder, right, as the temperature goes up, so our degrees C go up, our murders go up in the same period, right? The change in our independent variable changed before the changes in the dependent variable, so the temperature started to go up before the number of murders started to go up, or at least they came at the same time, and the observed relationship is authentic, so there's not a spurious criterion, right? So it can't be the ice cream sales because it's actually the heat. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. I hear muttering. I don't know if those are mutters of boredom or mutters of questions, but we'll keep going. Okay. Qualitative. So qualitative research, also really common. They're basically used when people want to understand people's perspectives, right? So it's all about understanding people's experiences or perspectives. Okay. And yeah, generally using an inductive approach, which just means that you're going from, you collect your information first, your data, and then you build a theory out of it, right? The data induces the theory. Okay, so inductive approach. Qualitative research centers around understanding how people interpret their social experiences, right? It's all about understanding how people see the world and how they talk about things they've experienced. Okay. I had that slide twice? I did have that slide twice. Oh, good. Okay, so one of the big methods that we use is, I already mentioned it, participant observation, where you take part in the social group being studied. And while you're part of the action, you make observations about what occurs, right? So let's say you wanted to understand what it's like to be an Edmonton Oilers fan. Well, you buy tickets to the next Oilers game, you charge that to your research funds. Actually sounds like a great study. All right, and you go to the game and you cheer with everybody and you talk to people and then you go home and you write down all of your observations, right? That's participant observation. Or you want to find out what it's like to, I don't know, anything you can think of, right? Be a comic book fan dressed in cosplay at Comic-Con. So you go to, San Diego Comic-Con dressed as, your favorite Marvel character, and you mingle amongst people and you make observations of what that experience is like. Goal of participant observation is to understand what it's like to be the member of a specific community. Okay, so there are some issues that come from participant observation. It's a super fun and super common way of doing research, but there are some problems. So one of them is, what do you do as a researcher? How do you avoid reactivity? What is reactivity? Well, basically, you're right, it's in the word. How do you stop people from reacting to your presence? And there's a bunch of different ways you can do this, but it basically comes down to two essential models. Are you doing covert research or overt research? So if you were doing covert research, you would go to this event probably dressed as, I don't know, let's say you're Wolverine. You go to San Diego Comic-Con, you're dressed as Wolverine, right? You move amongst the other Marvel fans, and you never tell them that you are a researcher, right? So that you get their authentic reaction. They're not reacting to your presence as a researcher. Now, if you were doing, and there's ethical problems with this, should people be allowed to know that you're studying them? These sorts of things, and you always have to think about that. And then there's overt research where you would go to, I would go to San Diego Comic-Con dressed like this, and I would have a name tag that says researcher on it, right? So that people know what my role is. Now there, you would have reactivity, but it would be authentic. Okay, gaining access. To a public event like San Diego Comic-Con, your biggest problem would be actually getting passes because they're hard to come by. But let's say you wanted to study some, let's say an Alcoholics Anonymous group, right? People might not want to be studied. You'd need to seek the permission of the members, to go in and do the research there. And sometimes people don't want you to. Gaining access is a big part of social research, and it's hard. Oh, actually, a better example, my boss. She is doing a big research study on prisons and reentry. So what happens to people after they leave prison? And the first stage of this is actually getting access to people while they're incarcerated. And she had to negotiate access with Alberta Justice, right? So she actually had to go to the Alberta Ministry of Justice, talk to them and get their permission to go into jails and interview people. And somehow she managed it. Identifying key informants, who are the people you need to talk to? Not every single person is necessarily worth your time to interview. Sometimes there are people who know more than others. Assembling field notes, this is writing down your observations, and then creating a narrative. What's the story of your data, right? So this is writing your research articles or books. Okay. I keep wishing there was a clock in here so I wouldn't have to stare at my watch. All right. Interviews. Interviews are the most common. Qualitative method. So we do lots of these as well. Okay, and basically there are two kinds: structured interviews, where you have a list of questions and you do not deviate from them, which are not super common. It's much more like a survey, so you see some structured interviews in, say, quantitative research, and unstructured or semi-structured interviews, basically where you come in with a loose set of questions and then you kind of follow through the conversation, right? So you talk to someone, they say something interesting, you ask them to elaborate, you talk for 20 minutes on that point, and then maybe you come back to your second question, right? And this is super common, and people do it all the time. Okay, I think I'm almost done. This is my last slide, and then we'll shift to something important, hopefully a little bit different, and then I think we'll have time to do culture before we get to the midterm. Okay, the last thing we often do is cases, or is basically case studies, which are studies of particular kind of examples. Now, a case can be anything. It can be a person. It can be a group. It could be a company. It could be a state, a country, etc. Right? Anything you can think of could be a case study. So, for example, right, when I did my study on Russian TV, I picked 5 different TV stations. And I did these in-depth, very detailed looks at these 5 television stations in Russia and the kind of shows they made. So I had 5 case studies. So I wrote these, each of my case studies is a chapter in my PhD dissertation where I look at these individual cases in great detail. And there's lots of this, right, that happens. And often we structure, say, sociological studies around a number of detailed case studies. Okay, actually, I'll go back and see if there's any questions. There are not. How are we doing for time? I have 14 minutes. I'm going to say that's too long. If I had 5 minutes, I'd let you go. But instead, I'm going to torment you with the thing I've already pulled up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about culture for a couple minutes, introduce it, and then let you go so that we get a start on it before next week. We should be able to do, this is actually shorter than my other one. Ta-da! Okay, and we'll talk about culture a little bit. Let me just make sure that my live stream is live streaming. Ta-da. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about culture, and then we will jump, we'll continue with this on Tuesday as we move towards our midterm. Okay. So, culture. Forward. So culture in the kind of sociological sense, we mean this, shared symbols and their definitions that people create to solve real life problems, right? So culture is how human beings solve problems, right? We create cultural ways of organizing things like social relationships, romance, sexual relationships, parenting, childhood, military, right? Conflicts against others. These are all organized by culture, right? And we use, shared symbols, shared ways of understanding to talk about these things and basically solve real life problems. And it's culture that allows us essentially to thrive in the environment. We also sometimes talk about, a distinction between high culture or the culture of elites and mass culture or pop culture, the culture of kind of everyone. Okay. All right, so when we talk about culture fundamentally is made up of symbols, right? Which are concrete things or abstract terms that represent something else, right? And culture is made up of symbols whose meanings are shared amongst a number of people. So if you have something that's meaningful to you, that wouldn't be culture. But let's say, your Oilers jersey, with 99 Gretzky on the back, that's culture because its meaning is shared amongst a substantial number of people, right? It speaks to the greatness of that hockey team and that particular player. Okay. So, the origins of culture, where does culture come from? Basically, kind of from an anthropology and sociology, we think of culture as basically coming as part of kind of the human toolkit for survival. Okay, so what does culture allow us to do? So one of the things that it does is it allows abstraction, right? The ability to create general concepts that meaningfully organize our sensory experience. Or to put it another way, culture allows you to experience things that you didn't experience, or to understand things that you didn't experience directly, right? For example, you don't need to see a tiger, and you don't need to be eaten by a tiger in order to understand that tigers are dangerous, right? Because we have this concept of tiger in language. And what is a tiger? It's a big, scary cat that can kill you, right? So you might never meet a tiger, but you know that tigers are dangerous, and you know that if you were ever in a place with tigers, you would know that you have to be on your guard, right? Because you have this idea that's been passed down to you through culture of the tiger. Okay, now among abstractions, you have things that are beliefs, right? Statements about what members of communities define as real or important, right? So, they have beliefs in, let's say human rights. Human rights are a belief, right? About what people define as real. Now, in kind of just in very kind of, let's say materialist terms, human rights don't exist. There is nothing out in nature that suggests that human beings have some kind of inherent right, to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, or whatever. It is a belief about what members of a community think is real, right? So why do we think we have rights? Well, because culturally, we've been taught to believe that we do, right? So even though there's no if you violate someone's rights, there's not a thunderbolt that comes down from the heavens, to strike you down. That's not how it works, but we've organized this idea of human rights to help us navigate the world and navigate social relationships, right? But they are simply a belief. Okay. Cooperation. How am I doing for time? All right, a little bit more. Cooperation. Basically, cooperation is the capacity to create complex social life, right? To work with each other that's governed by norms and values. And we'll define norms and values in a sec. It's super fun, trust me. So basically, we all, every society has things that are allowed and not allowed, good, bad, and, right, wrong, rude, polite, all of these things that allow us to basically cooperate and get along. And then we have production, which is the stuff human makes to improve what we take from nature, right? And this is everything from bows and arrows and spears, or a stick that you poke into a hole full of termites so you can get some yummy termites to eat. That sounds bad actually, but chimps do it. It's kind of right. All the way to a backhoe or an airplane, right? That allow us to get more of what we want from nature. Okay. I'll do one more, and then we'll go from there. Okay. Non-material culture, symbols and other intangible elements, right? Ideas and other things that kind of float out in the ether. And material culture, anything that people make, right? Tools, and I'll say techniques that enable people to accomplish tasks. So tools, right? You can think of things like knives, clothes. I spelled that beautifully. But techniques, right, would be something like cooking. Cooking is a material part of culture because it allows us to get more out of the environment. All right, people are halfway to packing up. Why don't I stop there, let you get to your next class, and we will keep going on culture next time. I think we'll have plenty of time to get through it before the midterm. So we'll see you on Tuesday. Have a lovely weekend. Thanks for listening while I talked about how we do social research. I will try to slow down. I just wanted to get through it because I know it's a little dry. All right.
Looking at the syllabus, I have an exam on 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. Can I get a compromise with you, or is that not possible? Does it need to be like
What days are is I'm trying to remember. Is it?
February, right?
Yeah, I just don't remember the date.
I have one on the 6th. I got 4th, 5th.
I'm just gonna turn the lights up really quickly so people can get out without dying. There we go.
I got physiology, microbiology, and then 4th class on the same day. Well, it's on the same week, sorry.
Yeah, send me an email. We can probably like postpone it a little bit. That's probably fine. Yeah, just send me an email and just explain your situation. Be like, it's the third one in 3 days, and I will figure out what we can make work from there.
Very awesome, thank you.
No worries. Yeah, it's on the fourth.
Oh wait, no, is 5th a different one? I kind of forgot. I know.
It's on the it's on the 4th. It's on a Tuesday. Yeah, so we have 2 classes next week, and then the midterm the Tuesday after. So, all right, no worries.
More about like the meaning of symbol in sociology.
Yeah, so it's basically like anything that's created by humans to communicate with each other, right? So it could be everything from letters and words to like a stop sign or a piece of clothing, right, that tells you like this person is the head of this organization, right? Like I think of like yeah, so it could be it's just anything that we create that has kind of that helps us communicate with each other in any way, right? So like I said, everything from like, written language, words that you speak, all the way to clothing that signals you, right?
So English would be as simple in this
English?
Yeah.
Well, so English would be the language, but like the word stop is a symbol, right?
Oh.
So the individual words and like every language kind of expresses it differently and has different words that mean the same thing. But yeah, each of those would be symbols.
Hi. Would you recommend studying for the
Okay, so